Thank you all for being here today. Dylan, as a sustainability advisor and researcher, what are some of the global trends that you're seeing around sustainability, and how do those sort of tie into more community-focused and local policies?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for being here, and thanks for having us on this panel. At NRG, my job, we generate electricity, we sell electricity, and my job is to make all of that a little bit lighter on the environment. And so in terms of trends that we see, especially since the 2016 election, in the absence of a really distinctive federal sustainability program, as all those programs have been loosened and those regulations have been rolled back, local governments are really stepping into the place where all of that would have been. They're really filling that void. So, for instance, when the Trump administration pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Accords, we saw cities and companies really come forward and say, we are still in, we're signing up for RE100, we're going to do this on our own if you're not going to do it. So that, I think, is that sort of mega trend in the US has led to a situation where we've seen cities take the lead and not only work strategically, but tactically, which has developed a lot of demand for the types of products that NRG and Constellation offer.
And Cheryl, as the grid operator in Texas, ERCOT, you guys are really responsible for making sure that our lights come on when it's 110 degrees in Texas, our ACs work. So how do sustainability goals play into your long-term planning at ERCOT?
Yeah, so let's talk about that just from a couple different perspectives. I think that, kind of picking up on some of the things that Dylan talked about, number one of the things that we have to do as the grid operators here in Texas is integrate our utility scale types of renewables. And so for us, that means that we are dealing every day with a lot of wind and therefore a lot of forecasting. And today, I think we had a pretty robust wind profile that we're expecting. So at the bulk grid level, we're doing the forecasting for load to make sure that we are able to turn that air conditioner or get, Paula and Jackie can, do the things they need to do to actually deliver that. But from the market perspective, we want to make sure that we are forecasting the load accurately. We're forecasting the wind and the solar that we have at utility scale here in our state. And we have in excess of 22,000 megawatts of wind, I think, today. About just under 2,000 megawatts of utility scale solar. So that's what we do today. Thinking about the sustainability movement as it moves down into the urban environment and into the cities, we know that we also are starting to see a significant amount of rooftop solar installed across our region. We are not California by any means. We do not have that type of penetration of that. But that adds one more element of planning and forecasting for us, is to understand how that is distributed across our region and how we account for that in our long-term load forecast. That's one more weather thing that we now have to think about. Where will the clouds be? What will be the response of those clouds? And how do our grid operators, who in the old days, when we were first established, all they had was, dispatchable generation and load, and we matched those pretty well. And so it's a much more complex world out here. So the other component that we have when we think about this distributed type of resource is in Texas, we also are prone to things like hurricanes here. And so we have seen significant investment and new business models around some dispatchable, small distributed resources. And they are particularly going after things like grocery stores, large convenience stores. Any of you from Texas may know of Buc-ee's. If you're not from Texas, go see one. You can live out of there, right?
I think people do.
They do. And so, it's a wise business decision for them to be able to install some distributed resource at their location so that in the event of significant storms, they can power up, they can pump the gas, keep their coolers cool, service their community locally. Great business model. On a hot summer day, when Erin's using more electricity than she typically does, because here in Texas, it's hot every year. Don't ask me how hot it might be this summer, but it will be hot. It's a given. And so our residential customers consume a lot in the summer times. And so making sure that Buc-ee's, either they can turn that on for their resiliency or their reliability, they can also decide to export to the grid, make a little bit extra money, keep their costs down so that us as the consumers buying those Buc-ee bites or whatever they are, get those at a reasonable price. And then they also could just reduce their load. So if the grid conditions are such that they just kind of want to get off, avoid pricing, but for whatever reason they don't want to inject back in the grid, they can also come down. So for us, we start to see this very distributed grid in the future, and we're worried about whether we get the information that we need to do proper long-term transmission planning. Do we account for those types of assets? And should we account for those types of assets and know their location so that we can properly think about them in the planning process? But also making sure our load forecast is accurate. People need to invest in generation to keep our market functioning, and so we need to provide adequate forecasts that they can particularly plan their resources around. And for those that don't know, if you're from out of time, it's an energy-only market here. So we don't go out and procure our capacity in this market. We have to let the market decide what they want to invest in, and so it's important that we do a good job of forecasting what the economy is driving and what that load looks like so that they can look at their opportunities. But more and more, we want to know what is down there at the distribution level, and so we're looking at ways to map that, send it locational marginal prices instead of letting them be settled at load zone. We want to settle them like other resources so that they can turn on when it's to their price advantage, and also not turn on when they can cause a reliability problem at their location. So those are some of the things we're thinking about, Aaron, in this new urban revolution of having resources come to a price point where they're wanting to be at multiple locations around the grid, not just at those big central stations.
And you say urban revolution. So Mike, people are moving to cities. There's this trend towards urbanization. People are migrating to city centers, and cities are growing. So what does that mean in terms of, specifically in terms of the electric grid, what does that mean for sustainability?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me here, and thanks to the audience for your participation today. Just to kind of pick up on what both Dylan and Cheryl were getting at, there is this trend toward urbanization. That is true. The other thing that's happening, though, is we're at this really interesting inflection point in the energy economy, and that's manifesting in our cities. So more and more buildings are being electrified. Electrification is a trend, and our vehicular fleet is being electrified. Secondly, more and more customers are choosing to have some form of on-site generation, often paired with storage. And the prices for these technologies continue to come down, which will drive them deeper into our energy economy. Third, we're in a trend where every building in the country that has a computer screen will also have a smart building management system that makes that building consume less energy or have a lower demand profile. All these things are conspiring to say the grid will be a distributed machine, and utilities have to figure out a way to participate in this trend. If you think about it, we unbundled, created retail choice for electric power in the 90s, right? And Texas went through that, Maryland went through that, where I'm from, and that was thought to be a big thing. But if you take a step back, that didn't change the physicality of how electrons are delivered to customers. Now we're changing the physicality of the grid, and that's a really exciting time to be in this industry. So utilities need to figure out, and competitive providers like my business need to figure out, how do we provide a service to customers who may not necessarily completely rely upon the old grid functionality to get their electricity. They will have buildings with a lower demand profile. They will have their own on-site storage or on-site generation. These things really matter, and they've changed how we think about delivery of this essential service to customers. A really interesting event yesterday in New York. The New York City Council voted to begin to penalize buildings for their greenhouse gas emissions and to cap building-wide built environment greenhouse gas emissions and create a penalty structure around that. This is a real point of leadership where we're seeing cities say, gee, we don't have leadership from the federal government. We may not have leadership from our state, but we can control this, and we can control what happens within the confines of our city. I think that's really exciting. It's going to completely remake how we think about electric service and how providers go and get paid to help customers conserve energy. Think about it. We make electrons, energy makes electrons, and here we are out helping our customers use less electrons. We're in a market where the fundamental demand for what we provide is diminishing over time. And so we need to all figure out a way to be relevant in that space.
And sustainability is, it's kind of a buzzword. It's kind of a nice and fuzzy word that people like to say, and it's nice to have goals, but have you all seen any successful case studies that you could tell us about? And Dylan, I'll start with you.
The amount of case studies that come to mind is kind of mind-blowing. I think over the past 10 years, and I previously worked with the City of Austin Office of Sustainability, so this is near and dear to my heart. We've seen cities all over the country really step up to the challenge of this new world of electricity. And I think it's a really interesting conundrum, as Michael mentioned, that from the perspective of those of us who sell electricity, people are using more and more of it, but they're getting it from places that are decentralized. They're not getting it from the places that we typically have sold it from. So what we're finding is it really, from my perspective, depends on the unique regulatory environments that the various cities are in. And I don't have to tell the people in this room that the US is a really crazy patchwork quilt of regulatory environments. So the unique context that the communities find themselves in really determines what it is they're trying to do. And I think a lot of cities do an amazing job kind of capitalizing on what their regulatory environment provides and allows, and also what they can do for their community based on what their community needs. So it happens that I wrote a white paper about a year ago called Powering Sustainable Cities, and you can Google it if you just Google Powering Sustainable Cities, NRG, if you want to read that, not right now. And so in the research for that paper, I did a lot of qualitative, in-depth interviews with sustainability and energy professionals in cities around the country. And it, first of all, was incredibly inspiring. And if you ever feel like climate change has got you down, know that these people are out there doing amazing work. And so what I found was in places like LA, they are doing really cool sort of tactical work, like paying low-income residents for their roof space and using that roof space to install solar that then becomes community solar. So that's a really innovative thing that they did. Baltimore is another city in your neighborhood, Michael, that has really taken equity into account and is working very hard to close the gap that makes renewable energy and access to renewable energy something that's only for the rich. Santa Monica, California is doing some amazing work with microgrids and taking their city operations, microgridding those, and then making that surplus electricity available to community pieces like art galleries and public charging stations. And then what we're seeing, I think especially in Texas and in competitive markets in Texas, we're seeing cities really jump on the bandwagon of using new and innovative methods to actually get renewable energy for their city, often at grid parity. So one of the things that we offer at NRG is a product called Renewable Select. And these types of products are starting to pop up around the country, whether from us or from other providers, where you can actually purchase renewable energy through a retail contract. That is a 10-page contract, just like you would sign for any other commodity electricity. And cities in Texas have really started to take up that method because it's just super simple. It's their typical procurement method, and it doesn't involve a 25-year PPA. It doesn't involve every department in your entire city and a contract that's this thick. So that's been a really huge thing here in Texas. One other thing I will mention is while NRG has a vested interest in competitive markets, because that's where we operate, there are cities that are actually kind of swinging the other way. So last year we saw Boulder, Colorado make the decision to pull away from Xcel and create their own municipal utility, which was kind of, I think, surprising to a lot of us. So, and I'd be curious, Cheryl, for maybe offline, what your take on that is. But basically taking what understanding what it is you're trying to achieve from a sustainability perspective. And in their case, they wanted to procure more renewables faster, and figuring out a way to do that. And if that happens to be municipalizing your utility, maybe a kind of a crazy way to take it, but also kind of cool. And in a lot of cases, that's not the way that they can take it, and instead they're taking it the way that I think Michael was describing, where you're kind of leapfrogging away from simple decentralization and into just complete freedom of how you're installing your backup storage and how you're installing your resiliency measures and how you're getting your electrons. So lots of, it's kind of the Wild West, which is part of what makes it really exciting right now.
Cheryl, have you any case studies to share?
I don't know that I have any real case studies to share. From an ERCOT perspective, it's that Wild West that we're a little worried about, right? We just want to know what's happening in each of those communities. From a bulk perspective, it's very visible to us since we're, involved in the interconnection process. But we do continue to work with our stakeholders and work through the processes to make sure, what is it you're installing? Down in San Antonio, they're doing some interesting things with batteries and mixing them with solar, and so we're working very closely with them to help guide that process. Those are some of the newer things that we're seeing, right? Especially where you've got a solar facility paired with that battery, and you want to be able to provide ancillary services, so that requires a certain type of generator, or a certain type of association, if you will, a sediment-only distributed generator versus a full market generator, and there's many different terms that we are cleaning up our language around to make sure that people can clearly figure out how to register those assets, because we're open to all resources. We like them all at ERCOT. We could always just use more. We have very low reserve margins right now, and I think some of the things that Michael's talking about are things that we don't, I think, fully know the capabilities of the distributed resources, and I think earlier that people were talking about, price sensitivities and things like that. I don't think that we yet know just how much of our load will be responsive to price signals, what the capability of the storage devices are that are out there in some of those buildings already that the utilities may have insight into, but ERCOT may not have all the insight into it if it's just behind the meter. And they've got a service provider or a grid or a building manager perhaps who's going to optimize that building. And so we look forward to being able to learn some more about that and make sure that we understand how those things are going to be thought of and factored into our load forecast and also the price expectations to the market.
Yeah, you're in a really challenging environment right now, flying blind a little bit as you suggest. I think I don't envy your position in that regard. I think you alluded to the fact that there's not a whole lot of behind the meter solar in the state of Texas at this point, but it's coming.
That's right.
The insulation in the state is fabulous. As long as prices for the core technologies continue to decline, as long as your utilities are investing in their infrastructure, thereby creating somewhat higher prices to end-use customers, you're going to cross those lines will cross, and we've seen it in other states, California, Arizona, in the Northeast, and it's coming.
Yeah, it is coming in. We surveyed everybody to find out who's got what in terms of DGs with all of our utilities and most of the non-opt-in entities or the municipal and co-op areas as well. And interestingly, while we've known that we're going to see increasing penetrations in the San Antonios and the Austins, just because we know the goals that those cities have put into their programs, but we really were surprised to see the amount of growth in some of the other areas as well, into some of the co-ops and into some of the other cities, because those prices are becoming attractive.
That's right.
Right.
And then in terms of case studies, and my business does a lot of this stuff, and part of my business is energy efficiency. But I want to go back to New York City. What the Port Authority in New York City is doing is really pretty fantastic. So the Port Authority controls bridges, tunnels, the 3 metro airports, and all of the buildings in the World Trade Center complex. And we've been working with them for a number of years to install efficiency measures in these places, in the buildings, in the tunnels. There's one structure that's really cool. The Oculus is that kind of whalebone-shaped building where the metro subway comes into the World Trade Center complex. It's really, if you haven't seen it, it's a visually arresting building, and we've done all the lighting in that. And it's now they've got LEDs, and they can change the color and all this kind of stuff. So you not only have like reduced energy consumption, but also really interesting artistic use of the energy as well. And then in the airports, the Port Authority has decided to electrify the bus routes. So they've bought Proterra buses, they've installed charging stations in order to create a more sustainable experience for people using the airports. The Housing Authority is also undergoing several major projects to reduce energy consumption in the Housing Authority. And you talk about sustainability being somewhat egalitarian. That's a great example of it. I mean, this is sustainability for everybody. People that live and work in these buildings, people that live in public housing in these cities, and it really becomes pretty interesting and fantastic to watch.
And Mike, you kind of mentioned this before, but we're sort of at this inflection point where people are really starting to engage and become more interested in the way they use their energy, actually engage with their energy providers. So as we implement new technologies and move towards more sustainable energy systems, what does that really mean? What are some of the big impacts for customers?
So customers, both residential and commercial governmental customers, are taking more of a firm hand in how they procure, how they use energy. A lot of it is sustainability and being environmentally conscious, but also a lot of it is financial. I mean, it's hard to go to a CFO in a major city and say, hey, I want you guys to pay more to be sustainable. When you go to the CFO along with the chief sustainability officer.
She was one, I think, by that giggle.
and you say, hey, look, we can partner up. We can get you to meet your sustainability goals for your customers, which is really what's driving that. And we can do it in a way that's not impactful to your bottom line. Now you really have a conversation. Remember, the cost of energy for a customer in a city is P times Q. It's price and quantity. You can pay a little more price if you're reducing the quantity and keep the cost the same or cheaper. We're out there funding efficiency measures for our customers, again, teaching our customers who buy our electrons to use less of them, because that's what the customers demand. Customers are seeing the value to their own personal bottom lines or their corporate bottom lines in doing these things.
And Dylan, here in Texas, we have both competitive and non-competitive markets. So depending on where you live, you can either choose your energy provider or not. So what are some of the potential differences as far as customer experience goes for people living in competitive versus non-competitive markets?
I live here in Austin, and so I'm an Austin Energy customer, which is a regulated municipal utility. One of the kind of nodes of regulation that still exists in ERCOT and in Texas as a whole. And I love being an Austin Energy customer, and it happens that Austin Energy is a very forward-thinking and forward-looking and well-managed municipal utility with a lot of resources. And so my experience as a customer of Austin Energy is one not only of kind of trust for what they deliver to me that they've decided on, but also one where I understand the reasoning behind what I'm permitted to do and what I'm not permitted to do within that regulatory structure. In competitive markets in Texas, you really do have a lot of choice and you really do have a lot of price competition. And so there are really good arguments for that model. And so as working for NRG, that can't serve Austin, we really try and leverage customers' newfound desire for that choice. And sometimes that's just, somebody shopping around for a retail electric contract and figuring out what the kind of price differential is and whether they want, they've got an EV, so they want free nights, or they've got, there's all kinds of considerations that go into how you choose your retail electric provider. But I think even kind of more exciting is what can happen when that choice gets even more disaggregated. So you can start to play around with having a battery in your home, or really like you can scale that from your home context to the city context, and really talk about how resiliency and energy efficiency, as Michael was mentioning, come together to kind of connect the dots around sustainability and make sustainability possible. So it's kind of just, there's kind of these two competing methods. In the competitive markets, I think things, because of that choice, I think things will move a little bit quicker. But my friends and former colleagues at Austin Energy, I think, do a really good job of kind of bringing what's appropriate about choice into the regulated context. Something that comes to mind that I see in a lot of cities that are in a regulated utility model, not so much in Texas, but in California, Midwest, and a little bit of the Northeast, is the desire to have more control over the electrons that you're buying and whether they're green or brown. And so we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years the concept of the community choice aggregation, where folks are getting together and kind of pooling their resources and deciding to, as en masse, buy renewables on their own. And I think that's it's sort of a proxy for competition in places where there isn't competition. So I think it's basically a question of regulated utilities a little bit being on notice that people want what they want, and they're going to find the way to get it. Like, they're going to crawl through any crack in the wall in order to get the thing that they want. And often, right now, what they want is renewables, and they want them cheap. So, so that's a little bit of like the NRG party line is always competition is best, and we will work to open up markets to competition because retail choice is a model that we believe in. But I really think that at the global scale, really there's a million ways to do this. And we're just going to see that customers are going to find those ways, whatever their regulatory context.
Cheryl, what are some of the challenges for ERCOT due to the different regulatory environments throughout the state?
Well, ERCOT really has the luxury of having a single regulator, right? So, we're a market that only has the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and, certainly our friends up at the legislature also, who help guide, what the shape of our market is and things that change that. So we don't really have to deal with the multi-jurisdictional issues. Certainly, when you talk about the non-competitive areas, as Dylan pointed out, those are some of the places where we try to stay, abreast of what's going on in those communities that are not opt-in, so that we kind of understand how their load growth and their patterns of consumption might be a little bit different. And I think that we have seen when we're doing our kind of Central Texas forecasting, we give a little bit different spin to the footprint of Austin Energy. When we're kind of trying to figure out what goes into our South Central forecast. And so, we try to stay up to date with what is going on, with what programs, and do a lot of reach out to folks in those areas. I think that we're probably this summer really looking to folks like Reliant, the retail provider of energy, to really understand how they're going to be working with their customers. I know that they've got some investments in technology and some different products that they have sold to their customers, and that they've got folks, on different services and different contracts. And so we're real anxious to see how they manage both messaging to customers during times of high pricing, where that might be advantageous for them to leverage some of those customers. So we're trying to get as much information from folks like TXU and Reliant on exactly what their programs for conservation and demand response are going to be. For those that aren't necessarily bid into the market, but are just the contract with the customer.
We've heard a lot over the past 4 days now about distributed energy resources and different ways of people wanting to generate their own electricity. Bucky's getting in on that idea. So Mike, how does a market stay competitive when there are people out there who are more and more wanting to produce their own energy?
Yeah, I'll answer it this way, maybe pick up on some of Dylan's comments. I will predict, this is a bold prediction, so pardon me. And when we're back here at ETS 2019, we will not be talking about the distinction between competitive markets and non-competitive markets. We're blurring that line, and what it means to be competitive is changing. It's not just selling the electron through the wire. It's providing the services to the customer, whether they're served by a utility in a competitive market or not. It's going to matter less and less. The example I use is, look at Atlanta. So take a Home Depot store in Atlanta. And then they're served by Georgia Power, and they're not open to competition for who sells them their electron. But I can go down there and do a rooftop solar system for them, energy efficiency upgrades for them, and a storage system for them, and nobody can tell them they can't do that. That's competition. And so what we think about as competition in the retail markets will be less and less reliant upon a regulator saying yes or no, and more about what customers want and how we deliver those essential services to those customers as an industry. That's why this is so exciting. And I think it opens up the world for everybody to make the choice that they want to make based upon their own sustainability and economic criterion on how they want to use and provide their own power.
And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, there's some people who just want their lights to come on, their AC to come on. So what happens to those customers, as we move toward decentralization? And kind of like to get each of your opinions, but Dylan, we can start with you.
Is it okay to say I have no idea? I think it's a super interesting question because I think there are definitely folks out there who just want the electrons to be flowing through the wire, and we need to be thinking about those people. And I think that's one of the things that having trust in your provider really actually delivers. So if you know that you can you've chosen Reliant, or you've moved into the Austin Energy Service area, or you know that whoever is delivering your electricity over the wires is going to do a good job, I think that in the transition period is going to be a very big deal for folks who aren't going to be early adopters of all of these new distributed technologies. On the other hand, I think it's one of those things where we didn't know that we all needed iPhones until we had iPhones. And so if my mom, for instance, doesn't know that she needs a Tesla Powerwall yet, she'll know it when it hits her. So I think there's just a technology swing that simply happens, and we all ride the wave when it comes. So it's kind of a non-answer because I think part of what's really exciting about this time is that none of us can predict what's about to happen.
Yeah, I'll take my ERCOT hat off for a minute and just be a consumer, right? And I think that consumers come in many different flavors, and I think that's what the panel that was talking about, how you use your data and know your customers and really research those segments, because I think I believe the vast majority of us still just want to turn the light switch on and the lights come on. And we really want that at a very cost-effective, right? I mean, electricity, we are fortunate that, for most of us, especially here in the state of Texas, even though it's hot and we run our air conditioning, it still is not a huge percentage of our household income that we are sending on that for the average person. There are a lot of people where the cost of electricity, because of our climate, and perhaps they're not in the most efficient building, and they haven't had the benefit of our earlier speaker over there kind of helping them learn some of that, that it is a bigger part of those. And so I think that there is the high-end user when it comes to the typical retail, non-commercial customer that's going to want the solar, the power pack, all of those things. But I still think that the bulk of consumers are kind of in that middle ground. They just want the lights to come on, and they may think that their utility is doing a good job by investing in some renewables, and doing things that they care about, and that might be good enough for them to engage with. But I think that we are probably going to see that just the price may start to drive that. And I do think that we all adopted these, but we all had a phone in our home too, right? And so this actually became more convenient. I can do my work from any place. I can call my mom from any place instead of having to be attached to the wall. So I do think that it's a little bit different in terms of its sexiness as a product and what it lets me do. Energy still is a baseline need. And we are very unhappy when it's not there. I don't know if we want to put the burden of it being there fully onto ourselves. And I think that for the average residential person, I still just want that wire come from the wall. If I can save some money and have that solar panel on there, if it makes sense, but I still want that wire coming to my house to be there, and I should expect to have to pay something for that backup reliability. And so it is an interesting dynamic where we talk about all these great technologies coming in that I can put at my home, but in the end of the day, I think they still want ERCOT counting to serve them on a hot summer day.
Yeah, I mean, look, the jurisdictional utility isn't going away anytime soon. There will always be customers that rely on the utility for a kind of traditional utility service, and I think that's great. And the utilities will evolve to be more of a platform where we connect customers to the technologies that they desire. But if you think about, and customers don't necessarily need to make a choice to be more energy efficient. If you go out and buy a television today, it's way more energy efficient than the television you would have bought 2 years ago. I just bought a TV that doesn't even have a plug. It's just got this little tiny wire. It's like magic. It's almost like it could run off of a battery. It's bizarre. So televisions, everybody's got a television. Hot water heaters, all of your consumer electronics and appliances are becoming more efficient. You don't have to make that choice. You just have to go down to Best Buy and get your thing, and it's better than your thing was 2 years ago. That's happening also. So all these things kind of go into the mix. What it means, though, is as utilities, the load that we have this kind of God-given right to serve is going to continue to diminish over time. And so we need to figure out ways to remain relevant in that environment.
And so one thing DeAndrea said earlier that I thought was really great was that communities that were historically left out are more moving to the forefront of innovation. So how do we ensure that that happens outside of Charlotte where she's doing the work?
How about someone else goes first? No, I'm just kidding.
I think that Michael's made some good points around what that is that things are coming down in cost.
Things are happening.
And I think that is providing, it is some of those underserved areas, perhaps they weren't the circuits that were the most reliable, and maybe there's some reasons why they may need some of that investment in just the natural ability to go out and replace the television, replace the light bulbs. Remember, these aren't the people that are necessarily at the top of the consumer pack, right? So they may need that extra help, and I hope that there are more and more cities like Charlotte that understand that, and that there is some very low cost, easy ways to help people be able to better afford those services, because I mean, it doesn't cost much to buy and replace the LED light bulbs today.
That's right.
That adds both to the temperature in your home and the quality of the light and the cost of lighting that home, and those are some natural turnover things that the middle class sees just by going to Best Buy and getting those things, or Target and buying new light bulbs. And so I hope there are people who are paying attention, and that movements like the things that DeAndrea do, that they're so low cost, that I hope that utilities and communities are both going to continue to invest in those communities.
It's an essential role for utilities, right? And we're doing that in our utilities, is providing those energy efficient products and services and the information to our customers so they can make informed decisions, and providing the rebates and providing a frictionless, effortless experience for the customers who want to choose to have LED light bulbs in their home or have a smart thermostat in their home, and making those things available and affordable for all customers.
From the perspective of public spaces and public buildings that we're all a part of, whether it's the school buildings that our kids attend or community centers, I think there's a big opportunity for us to actually green those facilities. I'm seeing a huge amount of work happen in Texas around even just, I mean, we're beyond low-hanging fruit. The LEDs, a lot of those have already been taken care of in a lot of these buildings. But even the smaller school districts are coming to the table looking for energy efficiency looking for sustainable supply of energy. And so I think that I think that those opportunities have kind of finally come to the spaces that we make public for our communities. And that is also a kind of an education opportunity for folks to take that stuff home. And as cities put together climate action plans that have in them the incentive structures that bring these pieces to bear, that can actually sort of trickle down and trickle out without it sort of stopping at the middle class.
We have just a few minutes left, so I wanted to open it up to the audience, see if anybody had any questions. There's one right there.
Hi, I have several different things are running through my mind. There's been a lot of talk about data and customer engagement, and you're talking about the punishing, the use of emissions. And I want to first start by saying to everybody, there's a Citizens Climate Lobby has a federal bill, I think it's 1281, that everybody go to their website. It's about basically a market-driven approach to address CO2 equivalent emissions, and basically it's that there's a fee, so what you were talking about, there's a fee that goes to people that are polluting, but the money comes back to us, so we're not the ones paying for it. So it's like when we got a tax check. So anyway, I really like the way they're doing that. They're focusing on the right things, which is CO2 equivalent emissions. And so the reason that is really interesting to me is because CO2 equivalent emissions, I think, is something all of us can do something about. It's like the goal in a game. Competition is going for the same goal, but through different pathways. And I don't care if it's the, decarbonization or it's alternative fuels with storage. There's a pathway for everybody, and it's like, how can we get everybody behind it? So I'm looking for cities that want to gamify sustainability and making it not the punishment kind of way of doing it, but reward and recognition. And, how do we, because, I see these goals for 2030. Well, what's the city's goal for 2019? Not the energy companies' goals, but the city's goals. And that's a way for getting people involved in a way that's not gloom and doom and shame and guilt, but reward and recognition, and look what we did together. So, I'm curious what you think about doing that, having that kind of approach of gamifying it in ever-increasing campaigns to meet a goal every year rather than waiting till 2030 and seeing, well, let's see if we made it.
Yeah, I'll start. Yes, and yes, all of the above, right? All tools at our disposal, all tools in the toolbox should be used. You think about a company called Simple Energy is providing that type of functionality to utilities now, where you provide rewards and gamification to incent certain behavior. In this case, it's energy efficiency, but you can certainly see how that could spill out into the city environment. It can spill out into the corporate environment. There are apps out there now that allow corporations to enable their employees to do things like track their greenhouse gas emissions and reward ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions involved in doing their business. So absolutely.
I had one thing that I'll add there. I think one of the important facets of any system, whether yes, and yes, we do need to reward as well as to penalize. But we also need to make it all transparent. So in Austin, we have the Energy Conservation and Disclosure Ordinance that means that you need to, I won't get into the details of ECAD, but it involves making your energy use available so that everyone knows your efficiency. And DC, New York, they've done amazing jobs doing that with their commercial buildings over a certain number of square feet. And so once everyone knows who the big users are, then we're better able to tailor our policies to make them make sense. And whether that means gamifying, penalizing, rewarding, we can find out kind of what the best ways to do that are.
Well, it looks like we are just about out of time, so everybody please thank our panelists for today. And thank you all for joining us.